Well met by moonlight, dear ones. I'm Curiosity, and this is my Jamboree, a firelit gathering for explorers of the uncanny, the frightening, and the hard to explain. Tonight, we spin tales of hooded figures in the bushes, campus creeps, and faces that are familiar, but not in a good way. So settle in by the crackling fire, lean in close, tell yourself it's just the cold that's making you shiver, and let's begin. Our first story is from r/Let's Not Meet, posted by Equivalent C47. I got a new job, and at my job there was this guy who used to watch me whenever he was around. We worked in the same department. We did sometimes work together, but it was rarely. All the weird stuff started a few months after I started a new job, and moved within walking distance to my new job. One October night I was walking home when a tall man wearing a hoodie came suddenly out of the bushes as I was walking by. I found this bizarre, so before I entered my apartment, I looked back and saw him standing by some trees watching me. When he realized I saw him, he jumped behind the trees to hide. I told my boyfriend, and he thought it was a drug dealer. Anyway, I started walking through a different trail when a month later, I saw the same man. This time he was crouching by the trailer of some parking lot. He got up and started walking away from me, but kept watching me. After a week he showed up again, but this time I was halfway to my home, and he came out of hiding behind the trailer and started walking towards me. I beelined for my apartment's door and ran inside. This time he knew which apartment I lived in, as the previous time I would walk around to the front door, so he wouldn't know which apartment I was in. He seemed like he was trying to figure out where I lived, as he could have attacked me multiple times. It doesn't end there. I got laid off and got a new job. After 3 weeks of working there, I was getting on the bus, when this guy who looked similar to the guy in the parking lot was watching me get on. I quickly hurried to the back of the bus. When we got to my stop, he pulled the string and got off. I got off as well, but then decided to wait for this guy to keep walking. But unfortunately, he slowed down his pace, seemingly waiting for me to pass him. I ended up walking behind him until we got to some lights, and he wouldn't move. I decided to walk fast and hide from him in case he was looking for my new job's location. During the time I was working there, I saw my ex-co-worker on the train when I was heading back from my interview. He saw me going in the same direction as him, and started running. He ran pretty slowly, like he had a limp or something. It was kind of strange. But anyway, I also saw him hanging out at the mall when I was there with my mum. But this really doesn't matter, as it's a popular place. Anyway, I got laid off from this job due to COVID, and had a month where I didn't go outside much. After a month, I got a new job within walking distance. After 1 week, I was leaving work when there was a guy just watching me again, and he looked so similar to the previous guy watching me when I was walking home. So I ran away and got to some lights and didn't see him. For a month and a bit I didn't see anyone. One night it was relatively warm. I was closing close to midnight and was walking home when I saw a white car parked behind some store, seemingly out of view of any security cameras. I was suspicious of it, as it had its headlights on and it seemed like someone was sitting in there. I'm walking by it and keep looking over my shoulder at it, until I decided it was probably safe. Anyway, not a second goes by and I get this feeling I should look behind me. I look, and I see my ex-co-worker walking towards me. I start running as fast as I could, and the adrenaline helped me get away. I didn't look back until I cleared some space between us, and I didn't see him. Luckily there were some men waiting for the bus at the end of the road, so I wasn't too worried he'd come running for me, as I've seen him running. So a month goes by and I didn't see him, but I assumed he was on vacation, as he showed up approximately a month later. Anyway, one night in early May, I was walking over to a store to pick up some groceries I really needed after work, as it was only 9 p.m. So as I'm walking there, some guy wearing a hoodie comes up from behind me. He starts walking towards the bus terminal, but I guess he overheard my conversation to my boyfriend, as I was telling him that I was going to the grocery store to pick up some stuff and walking home. So I get to the grocery store and get my stuff, and when I'm about to start walking home, I see some old-looking guy dressed like a teenager standing outside of the grocery store. He was wearing the same clothes as the guy I saw earlier, and he was watching me and trying to get close to me. I start telling my boyfriend to get me an Uber instead, and I walk over to some bags of fertilizer to hide from this guy. But he goes and starts looking for me. I stare at him, letting him know that I know he's up to something messed up. He stares back with these soulless eyes. And luckily then my Uber showed up, and I hopped in. I'm not sure if this guy has anything to do with my ex-co-worker, or if he was just a random psycho, but I do know that it helped me look out, and it ended up saving me as I made my boyfriend meet me after work. After that, I was extremely paranoid, and always on the lookout for creeps, and I made my boyfriend meet me after work if it was dark out. A few days later, with no bizarre events, my boyfriend comes and meets me when I see some car with its headlights on parked in front of a store we had to pass. We start walking by it, when it slowly starts driving away, seemingly watching us walking away. We get to some lights, and I see the same car now, in another plaza, driving slowly and watching us. Freaked out, I tell my boyfriend, and he gets scared. I assumed it was my ex-co-worker, as the car this time looked like his mum's car. I saw his mum come to pick him up at work once, and she was driving a car that looked like this one. The next night we also saw some man with a black van, with the passenger door wide open, hovering around it. When we passed him, he started to follow us, so we started to run a bit until we got further away. 10 minutes later, I saw some guy wearing a hoodie, hiding behind some building with his back against the wall. I don't know if the last two incidents are related, but it sure terrified me and my boyfriend. Mind you, I used to walk home by myself for a month without incidents, so I'm assuming once it was warm out, whoever had been watching me was planning something terrifying. After this, I changed my hours at work, even though my managers gave me a hard time, despite all the insane crap I was seeing at night. I got my managers to give me rides home anytime I had to close, or I would get Ubers, but I never walked again at midnight or after 10 p.m., even with my boyfriend. Anyway, I ended up seeing my ex-co-worker's car multiple times in May, when my managers drove me home. Eventually, I stopped seeing his car, as he realized I would never be out at midnight again. Anyway, I started getting morning shifts at work, and finally don't close anymore. However, I don't know if I'm done being stalked or not. Last month, the sun was starting to set around 9ish. I was walking by myself to the grocery store when I saw my ex-co-worker drive past me. I ignored it, as I've seen him in this area and it's probably unrelated. Anyway, 30 minutes later, as I'm walking back with my boyfriend had gone to another store, so my ex-co-worker might have thought I was alone, I see the guy who was watching me in the same parking lot. He's back and lurking around. He sees my boyfriend and me and starts walking away, but keeping an eye on us until we get into our apartment. Unfortunately, due to having in-person classes at my university, I'm back to working until 10 p.m. But I have my boyfriend meet me anytime I do. I'm worried it's all going to start back up again. I'm genuinely scared, to be honest, as this has been going on for almost a year. I'm sorry this still seems to be happening to you, OP. Whether the hoodie-wearing stalker and the ex-co-worker are connected or not, it all sounds very stressful. I really hope everything works out for you soon. Our next story was shared by an anonymous Reddit user. For some context, I'm 32 years old and female. This happened to me when I was about 25 or 26. I work full-time as a researcher at a university, which is where these encounters took place. I'm not a professor or anything, but because of my age at the time, I could have easily been mistaken for just another student wandering around campus. On some days, when the weather was nice, I would prefer to spend my lunch hour strolling around the university grounds outside, or sitting underneath a shady tree on a bench, enjoying the time I was not sitting in a cramped corner of a lab. On one of these days I was sitting on a bench, enjoying the fresh air, and a male student walked by asking if he could sit next to me. I'm a pretty shy and awkward kind of person, so even though I would have preferred sitting alone, I said sure. He initiated simple conversation, to which I obliged, but being careful not to be too forthcoming. He mentioned he'd seen which department building I came and went from, which slightly alarmed me, given I'd never seen this person before in my life, but I pushed the thought from my mind. After all, the weather had been decent lately, and I'd spent nearly all of my lunch hours for the past week outside. He asked if I was studying within the mentioned department, to which I told him that I was not a student, but rather I worked there. He told me he was an engineering student, and then followed up by asking me out to coffee sometime. I apologized and told him that I had a boyfriend, and would have to decline. We parted ways after that, and I assumed I probably wouldn't see him around again. About a week or two went by, and I was spending another lunch outside on campus, sitting on a different bench somewhere. Seemingly out of nowhere, the same man from before asked if he could sit next to me again. Admittedly, I don't remember what he started talking to me about at first. My mind was reeling, and I was rather uncomfortable having to potentially turn this guy down a second time. Sure enough, he asked me again if we could go out for coffee sometime. I apologized, and reminded him that I had a boyfriend, and would not be meeting him for coffee. And again, he left after that. I was feeling rather anxious now, but it still hadn't reached a level where I felt I had to be too concerned. A few days later I'd finished work, and was leaving the building to walk to where I'd parked my car. The university charges a fortune for parking passes, even if you're employed by them, so I'd always opted for free street parking about a 10-minute walk away from campus. My walking route would take me down several quiet residential streets, with minimal car traffic. Even pedestrian traffic was pretty sparse on the busiest of days. It wasn't until I was about halfway to my car down one of these quiet back streets that I noticed someone walking directly across the street from me, but keeping a few paces behind. I noticed him from my peripheral vision, and didn't want to flat-out turn around to stare at him. It wasn't uncommon to see someone else by any means. I was just trying to be aware of my surroundings when walking the streets alone. I had to make a few turns coming up anyways, and the chance that they would be going the same way as me was slim. But he did. He made all the turns I did, still walking on the sidewalk across from me, a few steps behind. I still did not want to look at whoever this was. I didn't want him to know that I was aware of what I thought he was doing. I quickened my pace to a speedy walk. I was approaching the first of two busier streets before I would reach my car. His pace quickened to keep up with me. That was the moment I panicked, the moment I was sure he was indeed following me. After that I started a full-out jog to cross the first of the busier streets. He ran to keep up behind me, and was now on the same side of the street I was. I was now nearly at my car. I had to cross the last busy street to get about 100 meters, and I would be there. But it was crossing the street that worried me. I often had to stop and wait a good minute or so before it was clear enough to do so. If this were the case, he would catch up with me. As if the stars aligned, as soon as I made it running to the busy street, I had a gap to cross. I booked it as fast as I could, finally turning around once I made it to look and yell at the man who'd been pursuing me. It was him. I could have suspected, but now it was confirmed. It was the engineering student whom I'd turned down for coffee. "Stop following me!" I yelled at him from across the busy street. "Can I just talk to you?" He yelled back. I didn't even answer him. The answer should have been obvious from the start, and I was certainly never going to give my time to anyone who just followed and then chased me for about a kilometer. I kept moving quickly to my car, so determined to get the hell out of there that I didn't even care if he saw which car was mine. He'd given up following me, and never tried to cross the road too, to my relief. I got home and broke down. Worse things had happened to other people, no doubt, and I was not harmed, fortunately. But I was shook. I had some anxieties walking to and from work after that. It wasn't long before a co-worker and I would walk most of the distance back to our cars together after work. I even changed where I started parking for a time. A few weeks had passed since the incident, and I'd not seen him around campus at all. I'd started spending my lunches in the lab instead of outside, but occasionally I'd go to the student center to buy lunch instead. This one particular day, the food court in the student center was packed, almost shoulder to shoulder. I was standing in line at a burger stall, and I heard a guy try to get someone's attention through the crowd. I look up, and it's him again, waving to me, and trying to make his way through the people. I panicked, and even though I'm terribly shy, I started a scene and yelled to him to leave me the fuck alone. His face dropped instantly as people stared at us, and he slinked back into the sea of students. My heart was pounding, and I was shaking. I don't even remember if I ended up getting food after that. I went back to work, and from then on was even more focused on my surroundings than I ever was before. It's been 5 or 6 years since then, and I still work at the university. I'm so relieved to say I never saw him again after the food court, and haven't had any other harrowing encounters on campus. I'm still diligent about being aware of my surroundings, especially when I have to walk to and from campus alone. I never asked the guy his name, so I couldn't even report an incident to campus police or anything. All in all, I'm just glad I never saw him again, and can only hope he never did this to any other girl before or after me. Well done for standing your ground. Some folks might feel embarrassed making a public scene like that, but sometimes it's absolutely the best way to put an end to someone's unreasonable behavior. Our last story is from another anonymous Reddit user. So this happened a very long time ago. Over 35 years ago now, but it was definitely creepy, especially what happened years later. I was in my early 20s and living at home while attending graduate school. I was dropped off home at night after a date with the man who later became my husband, the only good part of the story. My parents were in the living room with my older brother, Eric, and I went upstairs to hang out with my 2 younger sisters, Sarah and Laura, in the room they shared. The 3 of us, I'm sure, were talking about my date and other sister gossip, when suddenly there was a thump at the window. Sarah and I heard the noise, but didn't really pay attention to it, but Laura was closer to the window and walked up to it and opened the blinds. Suddenly, she screamed, and when Sarah looked at her and the window, we saw why. Staring back at us through the window was a man's face, on the 2nd floor of the house, no less. Seeing this man, Sarah and I both screamed as well, and the 3 of us ran out of the room and sprinted downstairs, screaming there was a man in our window. My dad immediately ran outside, alone since my brother Eric had some leg injury and was in a brace or cast, and was unable to join him. After a few minutes, my dad came back in and told us he didn't see the man or anyone else at all, but there was a ladder laying on its side right under my sister's bedroom window. My dad called the police, who came pretty quickly and searched the area themselves. They didn't find much, though they did notice footprints leading into woods behind our backyard. Unfortunately, they really couldn't do anything else to find him, though they did patrol the area for a while. Since it all happened so fast, and the 3 of us ran out of the room right away, we didn't get any sort of good look at the man. Not to mention, it was dark out. Thankfully, though, we never saw him again. However, about 15 years later, I was now married and had 3 kids, and lived in a house not even 10 minutes away from that house I grew up in. I worked as a nurse in a hospital, and one day there was a horrible snowstorm. The roads were awful and cars were snowed in. Me and a co-worker didn't feel safe driving, so we got a ride with another co-worker, whose husband was picking her up, and had a nice van that was better to drive in the snow. Not far from my first co-worker's house, we saw an older man, looking like he was in his late 60s, walking alone. Our driver pulled up and asked if he was okay, and the man said his car was stuck or something in the snow, so he just decided to walk home, since it was just about a mile away, if that. We nicely offered him a ride since it was so close, which he accepted. When asked where he lived, it ended up being the very same street I grew up on, a bit of a ways down the road since it was a long road, but still effectively neighbours. I commented on this, saying how I grew up there and my parents sold the house a few years earlier. He asked which house exactly, and I told him. He looked at me and said, "You lived at such and such? Wasn't that the house that had a man looking in the window?" Taken aback, I said it was. He replied, "Oh yes, I remember reading about it in the newspaper." It was never in the newspaper. I already knew that, but I even checked with my parents later that evening to be sure. The man looking in our window was never in the newspaper or on the news. My feeling is this old man was the Peeping Tom. The man we were giving a ride home to was the same man who I saw staring into our window 15 years before. Now, obviously that could be considered quite the leap to make, but hear me out. First of all, it wasn't in the newspaper. That was simply not true. While it's possible that this man simply misremembered how he heard about the story and assumed it was in the paper, I don't buy that. While it was extremely creepy and memorable to me and my family, was it really that memorable for a neighbor quite a few houses down to have it be the first thing he recalled about the house 15 years later? I don't think so. There wasn't any yelling or screaming outside of the house. There was no noise like a gunshot or fighting. Nobody was hurt. Nobody was arrested or even accused. The only thing that would be potentially memorable for a neighbor was the police being called, and even then all they did was walk around. They didn't even chase after the man or bang down a door. And again, this man in the car didn't even live next door. From his house, maybe he'd see flashing lights, but that's really it. So yeah, I'm 100% convinced this man was the same man in our window all those years ago. I think me saying that's where I lived at the time gave him some sick pleasure, remembering what he did, and wanted to see my reaction. Thankfully, I didn't have much of one in the moment, since I was so surprised he brought it up. After he said he read it in the newspaper, my only response was saying something like, "Oh, really?" And that was it. A minute or two later, we thankfully reached his house, and that was the last time I ever saw him. I wish I could say I confronted him on the story not being in the paper and pressed him, but I didn't. The thoughts I have obviously didn't come to me in the very short time we were together in that car. But after thinking about it later, and talking to my parents, I was convinced. I asked my dad if he knew the guy at all, and all he knew was the guy's name, and he was married. At least at the time we lived on that street. Obviously we couldn't exactly do anything about it, though my dad and my brother would say they'd like to go confront him about it. Now, all these years later, it's something my siblings and I will occasionally talk about, and even laugh about a little bit, like teasing my brother about being unable to go look for him, though it doesn't change the fact that it was a genuinely terrifying night. My sister Laura, who opened the blinds and was essentially face to face with him, still, to this day, pins her curtains shut at night, and keeps her blinds closed at night, and refuses to look out of the window when it's late. And even writing this over 35 years later gives me a bit of a chill, especially talking to the man in the car 15 years later. If I'm right, and he was the creep, how often did he watch us through the window? Was it the only time? Or just the final time? I won't say I'm happy he's no longer alive, since, sure as I am, I can't really know it was him for a fact. But I certainly don't feel sad about it, either. The sun is rising, and the unreality of story time fades into the reality of daybreak. The Jamboree is at an end once more. My thanks to everyone who sent in stories or gave me permission to narrate theirs. Remember, I upload new stories on Mondays and Fridays, so be sure to subscribe and click the bell icon so you don't miss out. If you have any thoughts about the stories I've narrated, why not leave them in the comments below? And don't forget, if you enjoyed your time by the fireside, to practice tying different knots around the like button. If you'd like a story of yours narrated, I have a submission form linked in the description, and I would love to learn more of your curious experiences and unexplained happenings. I will see you soon, dear ones, and until then, may your nights be dark and your dreams just a little curious.